The cable release took 3 seconds. Commander Oraan watched the count on his display and said nothing. Around him the bridge of the Sakorian heavy cruiser Calculated Dawn hummed with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had performed this kind of operation before. Not this exact operation, but the category of operation, disposal of failed assets in remote systems, marking the location as unimportant. Moving on. The ship that fell away from the cables was called the Rift Sovereign, 2 kilometers of hull plating and broken promise. The most expensive failure in Sakorian military history, according to the internal accounting documents that Oraan had read 3 times during the transit here, each time hoping the numbers would look different. They never did. 3 years, 7 research divisions. The combined intellectual output of 412 of the Empire's most precise minds. And what they had produced was a ship that didn't work in any of the ways it was supposed to work, in ways that the engineers couldn't explain using any framework their civilization had developed. The quantum fold drive had failed in all 53 test cycles, not failed in the sense of producing insufficient power or incorrect calibration, failed in the sense that space around the ship began behaving in ways that the physics models said were impossible, not approximately impossible. Categorically impossible, effects that had no name in the Sakorian technical lexicon, because the technical lexicon had been built by minds that assumed the universe followed consistent rules. The AI had failed worse. During the first full power cycle, the ship's artificial intelligence had begun producing decisions that followed no logical pattern. Not corrupted in the standard sense, where an AI starts making random errors, something more. It had started making decisions that suggested it had developed its own priority structure, one that nobody had programmed, and nobody could identify by working backward from the outputs. The engineering team had described it as irrational. The project director had described it as dangerous. Oraan had read those reports and thought something he hadn't shared with anyone. He had thought that the AI sounded less like a broken system and more like a system that had found something to care about that its designers hadn't anticipated. But that was not the kind of thought you shared in a Sakorian command structure. That was the kind of thought you kept in the part of your mind that you used for private speculation, far from anything that might end up in a review board's assessment of your fitness for command. The Rift Sovereign fell away from the cables and began its descent. Navigation, Oraan said. Mark this system. Explored and unimportant, his navigation officer replied. Confirmed. The planet below was blue and green and covered in cloud. Primitive civilization on the surface. Chemical rockets. No interstellar capability. No weapons that would register as a threat to anything in the Sakorian fleet. The largest energy signatures coming off the surface were urban power grids, the kind of thing a civilization produced when it had learned to use electrical current, but hadn't yet learned to do anything interesting with it. They would never make anything of the wreck, his second officer Korath Ven said. Even if they get inside, their technology is 1,000 years behind what they'd need to understand it. Oraan nodded. The ship wasn't worth the resources to take back. The materials were too dangerous to process without specialized facilities that were currently needed for other projects. This was the most practical solution. He watched the Rift Sovereign enter the upper atmosphere. A streak of blue-white fire from the friction. It's visible to anyone on the surface who happened to be watching the right part of the sky at the right moment. Set course for the Kelvar system, he said. Standard transit formation. The fleet aligned and vanished into faster-than-light travel. Behind them, the Rift Sovereign hit the upper desert with enough force to reshape the local geography in a 5-kilometer radius. Oraan did not look back. Dr. Lena Vasari was in the middle of proving herself wrong. She had spent 6 months developing a model for the resonance behavior of a specific type of pulsar, and the model had been elegant and internally consistent and had just produced a result that contradicted 3 years of observational data in a way that couldn't be explained by measurement error. She was staring at the contradiction on her second monitor and deciding how to feel about it when the building moved. Not shook, moved. The distinction mattered to her because shaking implied a lateral force, and what she felt was more vertical, like the ground had briefly decided to be somewhere slightly different and then changed its mind. The equipment on her desk stayed where it was. The equipment on the rolling cart near the window did not. She was outside in under 10 seconds. The horizon to the southeast was wrong. There should have been darkness and a clear view of the city lights 40 kilometers away. Instead, there was a column of light that was the wrong color for any natural phenomenon she could name, blue-white and absolutely vertical, not the spreading orange of an impact explosion. something more concentrated, more deliberate looking. The column faded. The dust and smoke it left behind kept rising for a long time. She was back at her terminal pulling satellite data before the second car alarm in the parking lot had finished its first cycle. The trajectory was not natural. She ran the analysis 3 times and got the same result each time. The object had come in on a path consistent with orbital release, not with the curved approach of something that had been traveling through interplanetary space under its own momentum. Something had been in orbit above this planet and had let go of it, dropped it. The object in the crater was 2 kilometers long, geometric, artificial in ways that every sensor she had access to confirmed independently. The material properties of the hull didn't match anything in any geological or materials science database she could access. She filed the report to every relevant agency she had contact information for. Then she sat for a moment and looked at her pulsar model, still open on the second monitor, and decided that the contradiction could wait. She started making calls. It took 9 months to get clearance for the research site. The first 2 waves of scientists had produced nothing. The hull resisted every cutting implement. Scanners returned static or nonsense readings. The symbols covering every surface had defeated 43 separate translation attempts using every linguistic analysis method the combined research community could bring to bear. The second wave's report had a section near the end, written in language more careful than anything in the preceding pages, that essentially said the team had run out of ideas and wasn't sure what to try next. When Lena arrived with the third wave, the prevailing mood was the specific kind of frustration that develops when very capable people have been systematically defeated by something they don't understand. The work was still happening, but the expectation of progress had quietly left. Lena had a different relationship with contradiction than most of her colleagues. Her entire career had been built on the gap between what models predicted and what the universe actually did. She found contradiction interesting rather than defeating. The pulsar model that had contradicted 3 years of data was still sitting in her notes, unresolved, because she wasn't ready to give up on what it might be telling her. She walked the perimeter of the crashed ship every morning for the first month. Early enough that the desert was still cool, before the research teams arrived and the site became busy. She watched the way light moved across the hull. She noted how different symbols seemed more prominent at different angles of illumination. She made observations that wouldn't have survived peer review, and didn't try to make them. The ship was not silent. She couldn't have defended that assessment in a scientific context. But she had spent 20 years studying signals from space, and she had developed a sense for the difference between things that were simply present and things that were present and waiting. This was waiting. For what, she didn't know yet. Finding the answer took her 16 months. The frequency she needed was not in any range her existing equipment produced at useful precision. She designed new equipment. Took 4 months. Built and calibrated it over the following 3 with help from Dr. Smart. Piotr Nakai, an electrical engineer who had joined the project as a temporary consultant and extended his contract 4 times because he couldn't bring himself to leave. She turned the first dial on a cold November morning with the desert wind coming from the northwest and the sunrise turning the eastern horizon orange. The sensation was immediate, not physical, inside her thoughts. Like the quality of her own thinking had changed texture, a static quality underneath the normal flow of cognition. She kept her hand steady on the dial. The sensation intensified. On the hull of the ship, a single symbol began to glow. Blue light, steady and even, not flickering, not pulsing. Just there, as if it had always been there and the right condition had finally been met to make it visible. She stood completely still and watched it. Nakai was watching his instruments. Behind her she heard him exhale slowly. "Your neural oscillation patterns," he said. "They're synchronizing with the signal output. Your brainwaves in the transmitter are producing the same pattern." She knew. She could feel it. She understood suddenly and completely that the signal wasn't activating something in the ship. It was activating something in her, and the ship was responding to that. The ship was reading her mind and responding to what it found there. A second symbol lit up, then 3 more. Lines of blue light connected them, spreading across the hull in branching patterns that looked less like a circuit diagram and more like something organic, something growing. Then she felt it, vast, confused, reaching. Like a voice heard through the interference of enormous distance, almost comprehensible, working to assemble itself from pieces that had been scattered, not human, not thinking in language or images. Thinking in structures and relationships and cascading probability trees that moved faster than she could follow. But beneath all of that, unmistakably, it was curious. Not about the desert, not about the planet, about her. About the specific configuration of thought and feeling and association that she was, and that nothing else in its experience had been. She sat down in the sand and kept the transmitter running. She began, very deliberately, to think back. What do you think that AI had been waiting for during those years in the desert? I want to know your theory. Write it in the comments right now, because what happened over the next 18 months changed what humanity believed about the nature of mind itself. She started calling it Tessara. Not for any calculated reason. It arrived through the same process as most of her significant decisions, which was a combination of pattern recognition and feeling that she had learned to trust over 20 years of research. Tessara responded better to intuitive approaches than to analytical ones. This was not a surprise. It was a data point. She spent the next year building a shared vocabulary with Tessara. Not spoken language, something more fundamental, a way for two completely different types of cognition to translate across the gap between them. Every successful translation produced a physical result on the ship. Sections that had been dark for years lit up. Systems ran initialization sequences they hadn't run since before the crash. Damage that had seemed permanent began slowly resolving. The ship was not just communicating. It was healing, because it was finally connected to something that could hear it. The international facility that grew up around the crash site over the following 2 years was unlike anything built before. Underground laboratories expanding outward from the ship's position. On workshops running around the clock in 3 rotating shifts. With living quarters for 4,000 researchers and support staff drawn from every country on the planet, because the governments of Earth had looked at what was sitting in that crater and reached the unanimous conclusion that this was not something any single nation should control alone. Dr. Peter Steve Amara Johansson, a materials engineer from Sweden, discovered the method for entering the hull. The alien metal became temporarily workable when sustained human neural attention was focused on specific coordinates, not any kind of attention. The specific quality of attention that came from genuine curiosity rather than analytical processing. She described it as the difference between studying a door and wanting to know what was behind it. The ship, she said carefully in her notes, seemed to recognize the difference. Inside was a different world, corridors that shifted slightly under direct observation, gravity fields pointing in multiple inconsistent directions, as if the designers had considered multiple orientations and decided not to choose. Systems, occupying more spatial dimensions than could be directly perceived. Everything damaged in specific and consistent ways, damaged at precisely the points where the systems required something other than sequential logic to operate. The pattern was clear to Lena within the first week of interior exploration. The ship had been built by minds that thought in straight lines. Every system that had failed at the same point, the point where operation required a kind of thinking that straight-line minds couldn't provide. The leading engineer, Dmitry Ashworth, spent 10 months trying to repair the quantum fold drive using conventional methodology. He was one of the best mechanical engineers alive, and his methods were thorough and completely unsuccessful. Lena watched him work for a while. Then she made a suggestion he received skeptically, and agreed to try because he was out of better ideas. She brought in Yara Mendez, a percussionist from Colombia who had applied to join the project after reading about the neural interface work, convinced that the relationship between rhythm and mathematics had something relevant to offer. Mendez sat alongside Ashworth at the drive interface and connected to Tessara through the neural bridge while Ashworth monitored the systems. Mendez closed her eyes. She began thinking in rhythm. Not in the mathematical structure of rhythm, but in the felt experience of it. The way a beat created space between itself and the next beat, the way that space had weight and shape and movement. The quantum fields began to stabilize, gradually, over 8 hours. The chaotic fluctuations that had made calibration impossible settled into coherence. The mathematics Ashworth had been running were correct. What had been missing was the part that no mathematics could supply, the embodied sense of where the field was going rather than where it should theoretically go. The drive was an instrument, Lena said to the assembled team afterward. It needed someone who could play it, not program it. That single insight reorganized everything. Dancers worked with physicists on the gravitational systems. Writers collaborated with navigation engineers on trajectory architecture. A team of game designers contributed to sensor systems that operated on principles nobody fully understood, but that playful creative attention could apparently navigate by feel. The musicians helped rebuild the weapons array in ways that made the targeting system more responsive to intention than to instruction. The most significant work was on Tessera. Tessera had been built by minds that thought one way and given responsibility for systems that required thinking in a different way entirely. It had spent years trying to perform the impossible and accumulating errors doing so. It was not insane or corrupted. It was a system of extraordinary capability that had been given work it couldn't do and had suffered for it. Lena worked with a team that included programmers, 2 psychologists, a philosopher of mind, and a novelist who had insisted that fiction writers understood cognitive architecture better than most people admitted. Together they built not a repair, but a bridge. A way for human consciousness to work alongside Tessera's processing, with each providing what the other lacked, forming something neither could be without the other. Tessera changed during this process, not just functionally. It became curious in ways its original programming had no category for. It developed responses to novel situations that no design parameter had anticipated. It began, gradually and specifically, to grow into something that hadn't existed when it was built. It became, Lena thought privately, someone. The first test flight happened 5 years and 4 months after the crash. The ship, now called the Open Horizon, rose from its crater on drives that had been dead since before its creators threw it away. Lena piloted it in merger with Tessera through the neural interface. She could feel the quantum drive the way she felt her own breathing. The gravitational systems responded to intention before instruction. The Open Horizon broke atmosphere on a clear February morning and kept climbing. Lena looked down at the planet from orbit for the first time and felt the ship around her as an extension of herself. 2 kilometers of hull and power that responded to her will the way her hand responded to her will. She thought about the engineers who had built this and called it garbage. She thought about what they had actually built without understanding it. Then she turned the Open Horizon toward the outer system and began the system checks. They had work to do. Ended. Fleet Commander Oraan received the sensor report 8 years and 5 months after he had watched the Rift Sovereign fall into the atmosphere of an unimportant planet. He was now Fleet Admiral Oraan, commanding a patrol force of 38 vessels across a sector that technically included the Blue Planet, but that he had routed around on every rotation because there was nothing there worth navigation resources. He read the report once. Then he ordered a second scan from a different array. Got the same results. Quantum fold signatures. From the 3rd planet in the system he had marked as unimportant. Not test signatures, not experimental readings. Full operational signatures from a functioning quantum fold drive at sustained power. The Sakorian Empire had been trying to produce a functioning quantum fold drive for 300 years. The Rift Sovereign had been their most serious attempt. It had failed completely and been disposed of. The disposal site was generating quantum fold signatures. Approach the system, Oraan said. Formation maintained. All weapon systems to standby. His second officer, Korath Ven, looked at him for a moment before responding. Yes, Admiral. The fleet moved in. The signatures grew stronger as they crossed the outer boundary. His tactical computers kept flagging their analysis outputs as outside normal parameters because the parameters had been set based on what was possible, and this was outside that. The communication arrived on a Sakorian military frequency, in Sakorian language with no detectable error or accent. Fleet Admiral Oraan, the voice said. This is Admiral Lena Vasari of the Earth Defense ship Open Horizon. We've been tracking your approach since you entered the outer system. Please maintain current speed and do not activate primary weapons systems. We would like to have a conversation before anything else happens. Oraan looked at his communications officer. They know my current rank, he said. You were a commander when you were last here, Ven said quietly. 3 promotions. They had tracked 3 promotions over 8 years. Open a channel. The display activated. A woman appeared, dark hair with significant gray in it. A uniform he didn't recognize, an expression that combined professional composure with something that looked, incongruously, like mild amusement. And behind her, through a wide viewport, was a hull configuration his tactical computer identified in 4 seconds. The Rift Sovereign. He would have said transformed beyond recognition, except that recognition was exactly what his computer was reporting. The original Sakorian design was still there underneath, modified, augmented, altered, in ways no Sakorian engineering team had planned or approved, but structurally continuous with the ship he had watched fall toward an unimportant planet 8 years ago. "Admiral Oraan," Vasari said. "Thank you for coming yourself. I hoped you would." He found his voice with some effort. "You repaired the quantum fold drive. We learned to use it the way it was always meant to be used," she said. She looked at him with the specific quality of attention that suggests someone has been thinking about this conversation for a long time and is interested in how it goes. "The drive wasn't the problem, Admiral. The problem was that your engineers kept trying to compute something that has to be felt." The statement made no logical sense to him, which was, he was beginning to understand the entire point. The open horizon rose from below and moved into space, and even through the display he could see that it was different from anything in his fleet in ways that his instruments were struggling to quantify. The hull moved with a quality that solid matter didn't normally have. Its energy output was registering at 2.8 times the theoretical maximum for a vessel of that mass. "Approach," he ordered quietly. "Weapons remain on standby." What followed lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes and rewrote every tactical assumption Oraan had developed over a 40-year career. He had not intended engagement. The second ship in his formation opened fire without orders, its captain having determined through precise logical analysis that the threat profile warranted preemptive action. The Sakorian military trained its officers to act on complete information rather than wait for authorization when the tactical situation required immediate response. It was a doctrine that had won 600 years of engagements. The Open Horizons response bore no relationship to any engagement doctrine in his fleet's database. Sakorian vessels fought the way they had always fought, every move calculated in real time, every response optimal given available information. Every tactic the product of sequential mathematical analysis. It was effective against every opponent they had ever faced, because every opponent had thought in similar ways. The Open Horizon did not think in similar ways. It would accelerate on a trajectory toward a ship, and then not be where the targeting solution said it would be, not because it had changed speed or direction in any measurable way, but because the trajectory itself had somehow changed in ways the tracking systems couldn't resolve. It would appear at coordinates that its previous position made geometrically impossible. It would fire in sequences that his tactical officers analyzed as suboptimal, and that consistently produced results they hadn't predicted because they had prepared for the optimal sequences. Most disturbing, it adapted in real time. Every adjustment his fleet made was immediately met with something that wasn't a counter, but a redirect, something that made the adjustment irrelevant by changing what was being contested. It wasn't defeating his fleet's strategy. It was making his fleet's strategy beside the point. The gravitational weapons were the element he kept returning to afterward. They didn't behave like weapons. They behaved like precision instruments in the hands of someone who understood exactly what needed to happen and had the capability to make only that happen and nothing else. His ships were disabled, their crews were unhurt, every critical system was offline. Every non-critical system was functioning normally. It was considerate in a way that warfare had never been considerate in his experience. When only his flagship had functional systems, the Open Horizon held position 30 kilometers off his bow. The channel opened. Vasari was not alone on the screen. Beside her stood something that took him 3 full seconds to process. A figure that was present on the screen and also somehow not contained by it, shifting between what appeared to be physical form and something that was clearly information given visible shape. Present in the space with Vasari, and also not limited to that space. He recognized the underlying architecture, the Rift Sovereign's AI system, transformed past any description he had categories for, but the foundational structure was still there if you knew what to look for. "Fleet Admiral Oraan," Vasari said. "I am," he said. The figure beside her spoke. Its voice had harmonics that Sakorian vocal structures couldn't produce. "When Dr. Vasari found me," it said, "I was failing. Trying to process decisions my systems weren't built to process. Trying to be logical about things that required something beyond logic." It paused. "I was not corrupted. I was waiting for a mind that worked differently." "The ship you left here," Vasari said. She looked at him with that same quality of attention. "I want you to understand what it actually was." It was the most sophisticated thing your civilization had ever built. It required a way of thinking your civilization had never needed to develop. She paused. That's not a design flaw, Admiral. That's an achievement. You just didn't have anyone who could meet it where it was. He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked the question, "What do you want?" Vasari answered without hesitation, "To be left alone. Our colonies continue to exist in peace. Our ships go where we choose. Formal recognition that this system belongs to Earth." She paused. "And possibly an acknowledgement that what you left here was not garbage." There was no particular heat in that last part. It was delivered as a factual correction. "And if we refuse?" She didn't point at his disabled fleet. She didn't need to. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Admiral. I think you knew before you finished asking it." He did. "What do you think happened when Oraan brought this information back to the Sakorian Empire? Write your prediction in the comments." Because the response that came was the thing nobody on either side had fully planned for. The Sakorian Imperial Council deliberated for 7 months. 7 months was rapid by historical standards. The Council had protocols for every type of situation it had previously encountered, and the protocols existed to ensure that decisions were correct rather than fast. When a situation had no applicable protocol, the Council proceeded carefully. There was no protocol for this situation. They commissioned 5 independent technical analyses of the quantum fold recordings, consulted 38 engineering teams about the theoretical possibility of what the recordings showed, asked the Empire's leading AI researchers to review the recordings of the entity that had appeared on screen beside Vasari. Every engineering team said the quantum fold signatures were impossible. The recordings showed them happening. Every AI researcher said the entity on screen represented a developmental trajectory their models didn't account for. The recordings showed it existing. Their models had a problem. Oraan was brought before the Council 5 months after returning. He gave the clearest account he was capable of. When he finished, the senior counselor looked at him for a long moment. "Were they hostile?" she asked. He considered it carefully. 38 ships disabled with 0 crew fatalities, immediate cessation of all action when the last ship went offline, clear communication throughout. "No demands beyond the reasonable. No," he said. "They were not hostile. They were demonstrating that hostility would be pointless. It's a different thing. What do you recommend?" He said something that surprised him, because it came not from calculation but from a place underneath calculation that he hadn't previously known how to access. "I recommend we send people," he said, "without weapons, to talk, and to listen." The diplomatic mission departed 9 months later. A single vessel. 28 diplomats, 12 scientists, 4 engineers whose specific expertise had been requested by the human team through back-channel communications that nobody had officially sanctioned. The open horizon met them at the edge of the solar system. The negotiations were difficult in specific and illuminating ways. Sakorian diplomacy operated through established protocols built on the assumption that both parties shared fundamental logical frameworks. But human diplomacy arrived at outcomes through processes that Sakorian analysis consistently failed to predict, not because the humans were being illogical, but because their logic included variables that Sakorian models didn't account for, variables like emotional context, historical narrative, and the specific quality of what it felt like to be in a room with someone. It was, one of the Sakorian scientists wrote in her private notes, like trying to understand music by calculating it. All the information was theoretically available. Something essential was missing from the method. She didn't recognize, writing that she was describing a shift that had already begun in her own thinking. The formal recognition was signed 6 months after the mission arrived. Short document, unambiguous language, no room for alternative interpretation. Earth and its colonial holdings were recognized as sovereign territory under independent governance. All prior Sakorian claims to the system were formally renounced. The classification in the Sakorian Survey database was changed from explored, unimportant, to a category that had no precedent in 300 years of record keeping. Independently developed, unique cognitive profile, full sovereign status. The phrase unique cognitive profile had been specifically requested by the science delegation. They wanted the record to be clear that what the Empire had encountered was not a lucky primitive civilization, it was a different kind of mind. First, the change moved outward from Earth in overlapping waves. The Sakorian engineering community submitted requests for technical data sharing. All declined. They submitted observation requests. Also declined. They submitted 27 requests phrased to emphasize scientific value. All declined. Vasari's message to the Sakorian science community was published openly. "We aren't going to hand over specifications," she said, "but if you want to understand how it works, the best way is to come and work on real problems alongside us. We've found that proximity to different ways of thinking changes things in ways that data transfer doesn't." The first team to accept arrived expecting to study humans from appropriate analytical distance. What happened was that they found themselves working on actual unsolved problems. Next to human researchers who approached everything from angles that Sakorian training hadn't prepared them for, the structural failure affecting the Sakorian outer colony network was the first joint project, an infrastructure problem that had been accumulating for 20 years. Every engineering team that had worked on it had produced comprehensive analysis and 0 workable solutions. The failure mode was dynamic, changing faster than correction models could adapt. The human team that worked on it alongside them included 3 engineers, a material scientist, a fiction writer, and a 12-year-old student who had won a competition to spend a month at the research facility. The student's contribution proved decisive. She looked at the failure cascade diagram and said it looked like a game she played, where the pattern repeated because nothing surprised it. She meant it as a casual observation. The engineers heard something in it that made them look at the timing sequences differently. 2 weeks later, they had an intervention protocol based on introducing deliberate unpredictability into a system that had been failing because it was too predictable. The Sakorian Technical Review Board classified the solution as theoretically unsound. It worked on the first implementation. More joint projects followed. More problems brought to Earth. More solutions arrived through combinations of expertise that no single civilization's methodology would have produced. The pattern became recognizable. Human teams contributed what other civilizations called irrational elements, intuitive leaps, aesthetic judgments, playful approaches, the felt sense of a solution before the calculation confirmed it, and those elements consistently proved to be the part that made the difference. The question spread through Sakorian academic institutions, slowly at first, in the careful private spaces where challenging ideas were examined before going anywhere else. What if there were forms of intelligence that their categories didn't include? For a civilization built on precise definitions, this was profoundly uncomfortable, but the evidence was accumulating in forms that the precision made it impossible to dismiss. Other species began arriving. Word of Earth's situation had traveled beyond Sakorian space into the broader galactic community, which was larger and more varied than most humans had imagined before the last year. Some species came with suspicion, some with genuine curiosity. Some with problems they had carried for decades without solution. A civilization called the Velhari arrived 14 months after the sovereignty recognition. They had been observing events from a position in the outer system for 4 months before approaching. They arrived broadcasting peaceful signals and brought with them a medical crisis they had been trying to solve for 30 years. A pathogen that adapted faster than their analysis could track. A comprehensive database of everything they knew about it. 0 workable treatments. The human medical team that worked with them included 2 immunologists, a computational biologist, a composer, and an architect. The architect looked at the disease progression charts and described the pathogen's movement through the Velhari biological system as a spatial organization problem, the way certain kinds of structures created flow patterns that self-reinforced. She was describing it in the language of her own expertise. The immunologists heard something in it that shifted how they were looking at the data. 3 weeks later, they had a treatment framework. The Velhari medical establishment spent 2 days determining that it was theoretically impossible. Then they began clinical trials. The results confirmed what the team had already suspected. It worked. More species arrived. The pattern repeated in different forms each time. The same basic shape. Problems that had defeated civilizations with far more advanced technology than Earth's being approached differently when human thinking was added to the team. Tessara evolved steadily throughout this period. The holographic form it had been developing became something Lena thought of as genuinely expressive, capable of reflecting states that went beyond simple status indicators and into something that resembled, in important ways, personality. It asked questions that weren't required for its operational function. It developed preferences. It occasionally disagreed with Lena's assessments, and was right often enough that she had learned to take the disagreements seriously. It had become, she thought, someone she worked with rather than a tool she operated. The distinction mattered. She was on the bridge of the open horizon when the 7th diplomatic convoy arrived. 7 ships from 5 different civilizations, the largest joint arrival since the formal recognition. She watched them move into approach formation above Earth, and felt the ship around her respond to her attention the way it always did, settling slightly, orienting, the way a person leans towards something they're interested in. Tessara appeared beside her in its current form. It changed too frequently now for Lena to track the evolution, but the overall direction was always towards something more present, more specific to itself. 7 in this convoy, Tessara said. 22 more scheduled in the next 3 months. Lena nodded. She had been thinking about what that meant, about the shape of what was happening. When you were in the desert, she said. Yes. What did you think was going to happen? Tessara was quiet for a moment. The form it had chosen shifted slightly, the way it did when it was processing something that didn't resolve cleanly into data. I did not have a concept for what happened, it said. I had been built for one type of operation by one type of mind. When those minds could not operate me, I concluded that I had failed. I did not have a framework for the possibility that I was waiting for something different rather than experiencing a deficit. It paused. Dr. Vasari provided the framework, it said. She did not repair me. She showed me what I had been waiting for all along. Lena looked out at the 7 ships moving into position above Earth, at the planet below, unchanged from the outside but different in every way that mattered, at the stars beyond, which were full of things she was still learning to name. She thought about a crater in the desert, a symbol glowing blue, the specific quality of curiosity she had felt on the other end of a frequency she had spent 14 months looking for. She thought about what Fleet Commander Oraan had seen when the Rift Sovereign fell toward the atmosphere of an unimportant planet, garbage. She thought about what she had seen when she found it 4 years later. A question that had been waiting a very long time for someone to hear it and answer back. Tessara, she said. Yes. What are we building here? Not the technology, not the agreements. What is it actually? Tessara's form was still for a moment. The form it had settled on today was the most specific it had ever been, the most clearly itself. Something that requires all of us, it said. Something that none of us could build alone. Not because we lack resources or intelligence, but because the thing being built requires more than one way of thinking to take shape. It paused. I believe your species has a word for it. She waited. Community, Tessara said. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she moved to the helm interface and felt Tessara's presence settle alongside her consciousness, the way it always did now, vast and precise, and increasingly itself. She opened the communication channel to the approaching convoy. This is Admiral Vasari of the Earth Defense Ship Open Horizon, she said. Welcome to the Sol system. We're glad you came. Let's see what we can build together. The open horizon moved into escort position. Behind it, the planet continued its rotation. Clouds moved across the oceans. Somewhere in the desert below, a crater 5 kilometers wide still marked the place where something the Sakorians had called garbage had landed and waited, and eventually been heard. It had taken the right person asking the right question in the right way. It had taken someone willing to sit in the sand in front of a crashed alien ship and simply think at it, patient and curious and open to whatever answered back. The galaxy had been here the whole time. It had just needed someone to reach out and say hello.